Hello, I'm Colin Gallagher, CEO at Onward and Upward, and you're listening to the Association Insights podcast, where each week we interview association leaders from across the country to hear how they're trying new things, taking big risks, and delivering value for their members. We'll explore the realities of what it means to work in and with associations and bring you the insights and inspiration you need to advance your career and make big changes at your association. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Association Insights podcast. I'm your host, Colin Gallagher, and I'm so excited for today's guest. We have Professor Leonard Steinhorn from American University. I'm an alumni of the master's program at the School of Communication there, and he was one of my teachers and the head of the program when I was there, and I fully credit AU with building a tremendous foundation of success for me and really changing the trajectory of my professional life and career. And Professor Steinhorn is a professor of communication and an affiliate professor of history. His expertise includes American politics, culture and media, the presidency and presidential elections, political strategy and communication, recent American history, the 60s, and race relations in America. He's been published in books, journals, The Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, Politico, on and on. And he was also twice named AU Faculty Member of the Year. And I cannot wait to hear from him today on this important topic. So, Professor Steinhorn, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
It's so nice to be here. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. So, you've been teaching media and comms for a very long time now. I'd love to know what you think has changed the most in how people consume media today. And then also, are there things that have stayed the same that are kind of surprise you?
A lot's changed, a lot stayed the same. As the French saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So let's talk about what's changed. The attention span of people is increasingly shortening, and that's really important. If you go dial back, let's say, to the 1960s or 1970s, and you looked at a typical news story, sometimes they would be 3 or 4 minutes long, where the reporter would interview a lot of people, they'd tell the long story, they'd give a lot of context and all the rest. Now you can't get a story that's maybe more than in a minute and a half if you're lucky. So the attention span has been shortening. As people used to say in politics, what matters is the soundbite. And the soundbite has reduced from the 60s to 30 seconds to maybe 7 or 8 seconds. So people's attention span has really limited. Plus the other thing that limited their attention span, and I often say that one of the biggest yet underrated inventions of the 20th century was the remote control. Because it gave the consumer of media the power to shift from one outlet to another and then translate that online to the mouse. And the mouse enabled us to click many times without keeping our attention focused on one thing. If you grew up in the 1960s and 1970s before remote controls came in, you were literally sitting on your couch watching television, and you would have to get up and change the channel and then sit back down again. The remote control gave you power, the mouse gives you power, the iPhone gives you power, you can scroll, you can shift, you can see lots of things. So with the attention span shortening, therefore content creators have had to be able to figure out how to communicate the same messaging, the same ideas, and the same narratives within a shorter attention span. Now it doesn't mean that people have to spend less time, but they have to mix it up better. They have to be able to capture people's attention in a way that they stay with a particular site. So that brings on the power more of visuals, the power more of things that are emotionally intense, because you want people to stay in tune, okay? So attention span is a big part of it. Another thing that's changed is the fragmentation of media. With the rise of cable, all of a sudden you began to see more channels, more outlets, more opportunities for people to be able to follow the things that they cared about and that they like. And of course, that's gone in multiples with the internet. And with every possible site, every bit of social media, every newspaper, every platform, anybody can become their own publisher and put something out. You look at Substack these days, and that's just been mushrooming in terms of the number of sites. So the fragmentation of media is intense. So there are so many opportunities for people to, if they're bored with something, to move on to something else that they like, and there are lots of things. And along those lines is increasingly the privatization of media. And by that, what I mean is that everyone has their own reading list. Everyone has their own playlists for music. So I often tell my students when I teach my 1960s class that when you listen to music, you sat together, you listened, you talked, and everybody listened to the same albums and the same music all the time. Now everyone has their earbuds and they've privatized their sound lists. And that's a metaphor for how we look at media these days. And if I often tell my students in a class, let's say of 25, if I actually said, okay, freeze, I'm going to look at what you've been looking at on your laptop and on your iPhone and all the rest. In a class of 25, within the first 10 minutes before class starts, I could probably see 250 sites that would be different from each other and the person sitting next to somebody else. So there's been media fragmentation. So again, because attention span is shorter and fragmentation is larger, there are all sorts of opportunities for people to shift from one to the next. And what it all creates with a shorter attention span and fragmentation is the requirement that content creators provide snackable material. Okay, it's not often a big feast. If you want to invite them into a feast, you've got to give them something snackable that keeps them there, that intrigues them, that gets them thinking. It's that sugar high or salt high of a snack that's the equivalent of what you want to do when you bring people in. And then, of course, there's the A word, algorithms. And that's the other thing that sort of the social media sites have learned how to keep people's attention in a way that's sometimes toxic because it appeals to some of the worst instincts and anxieties and fears that people have and sends them down a rabbit hole that the algorithms determine based on what is the profit model of social media. So algorithms on social media create a real problem potentially for content creators who want to communicate good, honest, realistic, fact-based content because that's not always rewarded on algorithms. So I think there are a number of things that have changed, but here's the thing, especially since the era of television. Television and the visual image, they are emotional, okay? They're not necessarily cognitive. How we respond to images on TV, it's fundamentally emotional. So the emotional content of communication has been consistent over time. It may be magnified right now because of the shorter attention span and because of the need to keep people on particular sites, but media remain emotional. So if you get up there as a talking head and give them facts and information, that's great. But people will click on something else after the first few sentences. So you've got to reach them. And how do you reach them? You reach them through something that's ever present since Greek mythology and religious texts, which is narrative and stories. So that hasn't changed. And the ability to tell stories that are engaging remains an essential part of media. And in fact, if you want to be able to communicate facts and information, you often do it by telling that story first, engaging somebody, then bringing them into the larger point, and then concluding with what that story that you started with often means in the context of the information that you're communicating. So that hasn't changed. Messaging hasn't changed. The whole notion that with a message, it's not the message you tell somebody else that's important. It's what your audience tells themselves and others. It's the story that they tell themselves and others. So the importance for a good communicator is, as it always has been, is how do you convey information that gets people to tell themselves and their friends and their family and their colleagues and their peers a story as to why they care about something, or why something is important, or why something is valuable, or why they want to associate with it. That hasn't changed. All you have to do now is sort of adapt it to this new media ecosystem that we're in.
Yeah, I love that perspective about the remote and the mouse, because I think when we think of the technologies that have changed our world, those don't come top of mind. But wow, when you lay it out like that, what an impact. I do want to dig a little more into that fragmentation and messaging piece. So we obviously are very fragmented when it comes to the media. It's very feelings driven. For our audience of association professionals, how can they cut through with messaging that's going to be effective? It's going to be ethically grounded. You mentioned the storytelling piece, but how do you really break through?
First of all, they have to understand their audience and the hopes and aspirations and needs and anxieties of their audience. That's point number one. So in many ways, you've got to do your research first, okay? And understanding who they are, what they're thinking, what can reach them, the stories that they care about, that's got to be it, really. Because again, insofar as communication is really an emotional medium, okay? And you then build facts on top of the emotions and you rationalize that emotional narrative that you're telling people, that's what you have to be able to do. In effect, it's understanding your audience, knowing what they care about, knowing what they feel or think or relate to, and then finding evidence within your association to be able to tell those stories that will connect with people. And I think that's the most important thing. And here's the thing, every association has not only its own story, but the story of its members, the story of the people that have been influenced by what the association does. And people relate to that. They want to hear more about it. And once you grab them with those stories, then you can tell the larger story of what your association is doing. And as long as one remains true to the evidence, true to the facts, true to the association's mission and message, and doesn't in any way, shape, or form try to hide, mislead, or shade the truth, that's ethical communication. I often say that the best organizations are those that do well and also do good. And one can do well by doing good. And by doing good, if you're an association and you're representing well-intended, good-natured people who want to just pursue their careers and their professions and their businesses and do good for their communities and for themselves, they will then do well. So once you connect the doing well and the doing good together, you have a form of ethical communication that gets translated through the stories that your association can tell. And I think that's the best way to look at it. We often mistake ethical communication with a certain set of issues, but it's not. It's a certain set of intentions. And it's a certain form of honest communication that people care about. If you be honest with them, you have good intentions, you do good things for the community, do good things for your customers and your clients or your stakeholders, that's ethical communication. We all can't agree on the same issues, but we can agree on motivation. And if somebody's motivation is good, that will come through in their communication.
Yeah, I think that's so spot on. I love the piece about telling member stories because the associations I see have the most success getting media coverage. They do that and they let their members shine and really stand out. So that's definitely a huge piece there. On the storytelling piece there, do you see common mistakes in storytelling that maybe hinder people from breaking through or telling those good stories?
I think if a story comes off as too abstract, that's one thing. Look, I've written nonfiction books, and I will make an argument and develop an argument with lots of facts and everything. But in terms of communicating to a larger public, you've got to be able to ground it in good and relevant stories. So don't get too abstract, don't get too vague, don't get too insular, and avoid jargon. What happens with jargon is that when people in an association or organization talk to each other, they have a shorthand way of doing it. So they speak in a form of jargon to each other. You've got to scrub that and erase that from the communication in general, because the minute anyone gets into any form of jargon, you're speaking only to yourselves and not to a larger public who may not know what that jargon really is. So I think that's another mistake that people use, is using language and jargon that's not accessible to a broader audience. So people have to be careful. And I often say to people, sometimes when you write, if you write in a form of jargon, yeah, you may get it. But whether you get it or not is irrelevant. Does your reader get it? Does your audience get it? And if they can't understand that jargon, what's the phrase in Brooklyn? Forget about it. You're not going to reach them in any way, shape, or form. So I think that's another mistake, is that when associations get too insular, they often think that the words that they need to use, because they're important to people in the organization or association, have to be in the communication, when those words may not be relatable to the people that they need to reach. And I think that's a very important rule here.
Yeah, I want to just cut out that snippet about the jargon and put that in our media training toolkit because that is so necessary for associations, because we do. we have these acronyms and so much jargon. Not that all companies don't, but I think in the association world, it's so prevalent. So I love that. I want to shift gears just a little bit here. One of the things when we were emailing to set this interview up that stuck out to me was you said that you often tell your students about the difference between media and journalism. And I think you might have been hinting at that earlier. We were talking about what content creators have to do and the snackable bites, but I'd love to know more about what you mean by that and why that distinction really matters.
Look, there's a reason why freedom of the press is protected in the First Amendment, and it's the only business essentially protected in the First Amendment, because a democracy cannot survive without the press. And by the press, journalism, people who dig out the facts, who speak truth to power, who, as the old journalists would say, afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, by telling those stories that are based on the lived experience of Americans or what Americans are doing or people around the world are doing, but that give us the knowledge and evidence we need to be able to make informed decisions. And another thing our founders did is that they just didn't imagine a government based on the consent of the governed. They imagined a government based on the informed consent of the governed, which is one of the reasons why they protected the press in the First Amendment. And so that's journalism. And we have to protect and respect and honor journalism at every cost, even if it comes up with evidence and facts that doesn't make us comfortable, because we can't live in a society that deceives itself into thinking that what anyone wants or does is good simply because they want to do it or do it. If it is flawed, if it is not providing good services, if it is corrupt, if it is damaging society or polluting rivers and streams, journalism will smoke that out. Journalism will reveal it. The truth is evident. We need that as a society. We need that as an economy. We need that as a culture. We need that as a democracy. That's separate from media, because anything can be on media. Media can be entertainment. It can be a movie, a TV show. It can be an influencer getting up there and hawking certain goods or telling you why they like a certain book or a certain medicine or whatever it happens to be. That's media. So media is a much larger ecosystem that we're in, whereas journalists are part of the media ecosystem but have a particular mission and a particular task. So we have to respect and maintain the integrity and importance of journalism, and we have to understand the media ecosystem that we're in to be able to communicate within it. So think about public relations. Public relations is part of the media ecosystem. Every organization and institution produces public relations. Your website is public relations. Any speech or talk or talking points by a CEO is public relations. Any video you put out promoting a product is public relations. Even any time you say, hey, we're doing good in our community and we're promoting health in our community, or we're supporting a hospital, or we're supporting a march against cancer, that's public relations, okay? And so everybody in society, in the economy, has to master public relations, has to master the media ecosystem that we're in, has to understand the growing importance of these influencers, has to be able to know that Substack is now a place that a lot of people are going to for their information as much as they may the New York Times and the Washington Post. People have to understand the power of visuals. They have to understand what's going on MSNBC and Fox and CNN. All of that they have to be able to understand as part of the media. But journalism, that's, even though it's within the media ecosystem, it's separate because it's designed to be evidence and fact-based and tell the story of our society so that we can make better decisions about our economy, our government, and our culture. So there's a distinction there. But what happens is this: when people go and attack the media, journalism gets swept up in that. So when you hear any ideologue or any commentator or opinion maker or whatever go on in the media, that's not necessarily journalism. But because journalism is part of that, it gets caught in the undertow and people therefore attack it. And I think that's very unfortunate for our society, our economy. I work with journalism students all the time. I know the work they do. I know that they are on a mission to tell the truth, to be good journalists, to root out information, and to be able to create evidence and stories that help people make decisions in their lives. We shouldn't go after the messengers who provide that information. If anything, we should be more sophisticated about the media world that we're in and understand that's much larger than journalism. And I think that's really an important message for most people. So for me, our democracy depends on good journalism. I will do everything I can support the free press and the institutions of the press. But when it comes to all of the influencers and all of the videos and all of the other stuff that show up in the media, I take it with a grain of salt. I look at it skeptically. I see if it's of value. I investigate it myself. But with journalism, I know that their mission is to get the evidence, and I do trust them because I know the profession.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for anyone when they're consuming media versus journalism, to understand what they're looking at, how to take it. So I really appreciate that. Your episode is actually going to air right on the heels of a series we did on Gen Z and workforce. And I'd be curious your perspective with these younger generations entering the workforce. How are AU students approaching communicating differently, and what are they valuing when it comes to media and messaging?
It's interesting. When I ask my classes where they get their news, and I put that in air quotes, a lot of them say TikTok. Okay. And sort of it may be dating me, but it drives me crazy.
With you.
Because TikTok folks may be reading stories in the Washington Post, but they're not journalists, and they end up pontificating or selectively producing evidence and information. Okay. And a step back on something like this, because think about the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, okay? Their editorial pages are fundamentally different, and you can read those editorials for how a newspaper does their interpretation of the news. But their news gathering, it doesn't matter whether the Wall Street Journal is conservative or the New York Times is liberal on their editorial pages. The news gathering of both of those papers is amazing. And that's what's important to know. So when we end up with TikTok folks who read a couple of articles and think they're informed, and then all of a sudden they are communicating that news to a younger generation, it gives me the chills, because they are not trained journalists. They are people who read some things and basically use what they've read to be able to claim that they're experts. Many of them might not have studied history or the context of why certain things are happening, but they're out there, and because of algorithms and because they're interesting or because they're exciting or because they're good communicators, they grab the attention of a lot of people in Gen Z. I guess we have to adapt, but we have to know that this is where, at least at this moment in time, that Gen Z is getting a lot of their information. They're getting it on Instagram, they're getting it on TikTok, they're getting it on YouTube. Are they reading regular papers? Sometimes they are. Are they reading the Washington Post and the New York Times? Sometimes they are. But they are gravitating to those social media sites. So I think that's really important. I think also with Gen Z is because of what I talked about earlier, is their privatized experience. Because everybody is looking at different media, then we have to realize that in a world of media fragmentation and privatization, where not everybody is watching the evening news with Walter Cronkite or one of the 3 evening news shows where 40 years ago, 70 to 80% of the country was tuned into one of those 3. Right now, not only are those news shows reaching just a tiny little percentage of the American people, but every other form of media is fragmented. So I think to some extent, we have to be able to work with Gen Z that knows this fragmentation of the media. We have to be able to pick their minds about the things that are important, but we also have to be able to find a way to be able to communicate and reach as many people as possible through the media that we have available to communicate. And I think that's really a challenge right now with Generation Z and their media habits. But there's also another aspect here. Forget all of the static and the noise sometimes that get reported through polls. They remain the most socially liberal generation and the least prejudiced generation in our history. Doesn't mean that everybody is socially liberal, and it doesn't mean that everyone is inclusive. Doesn't mean that everyone is as free of prejudice as any generation has ever been. But here's the point for organizations and associations. You want to be able to show Gen Z that you do care about their lives and their future, that you do have a stake in protecting this planet, which is a very big issue for Gen Z, in providing for their security and for giving them the opportunities that they need to be able to reach the American dream. And I think to some extent, they want companies to do well, but also to do good. And insofar as a company can show that they're doing good, that's really important. And it doesn't really matter if they choose a particular issue or not. What are they doing with their community? What are they doing with their employees? Are they treating people well? And are their products or services benefiting society rather than simply providing a sugar rush for a particular product that does well in the moment but isn't very sustainable? So I think that's really important, is the value system of Gen Z. Any association has to be able to know that's what they're thinking and that's who they are. And again, what comes after that, I don't know. Is the next generation going to be different? I don't know. But let's be clear. We are living in an existential moment with our globe and global warming and the disruption that's creating. And that's only going to get worse over the next few decades. And this next generation or next generations, they're the ones who are going to be living with the consequences of all of that. So I do think one of the prime issues that companies have to be able to think about is how they convey their concern about the future health and well-being and sustainability of future generations. This is what young people want to be able to hear about, that you are committed to these things. So it's a matter of understanding how they consume media and understanding their value system that I think is important for reaching Gen Z.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I want to build on that and turn into trust a little bit. So we see the Edelman Trust Barometer. We hear stories all the time. No one trusts, whether it's media, but largely like institutions have lost the trust of Americans. So I'm wondering if you think there's a role associations can play in restoring that trust, or at least within their stories and their industries, building trust back up for those companies.
It's a challenging environment right now because algorithms are basically built on distrust, because they basically say, don't trust what you have to see the next thing. And so in a culture in which the media make money based on an algorithm that gets people to distrust things and to seek other things out, or to be outraged at something that went wrong, this is a problem. And because we always highlight what went wrong rather than what went well, that's another problem. But we have to go back 6 decades, okay, when trust in government was pretty high. You were really up around 75% of people trusted government. And then what happened? You had Vietnam War, which was a war that ultimately was unjustifiable and unjustified. And when the Pentagon Papers revealed that the government was lying to the American people and misinforming and not giving us the truth, that was a real problem with trust in government. And then right on top of that, you had Watergate, and you had President of the United States trying to undermine elections, undermine our Constitution. So people began to wonder, can I really trust government and trust those institutions that are there to protect me? So you already began to see an erosion of trust from the 1960s onward because of Vietnam and Watergate. And there have been spikes upward. Let's say during 9/11 you saw a spike upward, but it quickly went down, especially when the Bush administration got us involved in Iraq and with the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. So people were feeling distrustful at that particular point, but it's a generational thing. So how do you build trust again? And you have to be able to show in a consistent way that you are not just doing well, but doing good, but also be transparent. If you think about organizations and companies that have had hiccups or stumbles, The ones that have been generated the most trust are the ones that were transparent about it and talked about how they were going to improve or how they were going to rectify. The classic case, of course, being the crisis situation back 4+ decades ago when somebody put cyanide in Tylenol capsules, okay? Tylenol, they had nothing to do with this. This was product tampering by somebody. Tylenol owned it. They pulled everything back. They created new sort of tamper-proof bottles and everything else. And that restored the trust among people because they felt that Tylenol was doing the right thing and thinking about us, not just about them. You then think about a crisis a few years later when the Exxon Valdez went aground in Alaska and there was a huge oil spill. And it seemed like Exxon had contempt for the people of Alaska, for the environment. They didn't seem to care. And all of a sudden, their trust factor went down. So I think part of it is transparency, showing people that you're doing things on their behalf, that you care about them, that everything you're doing is there to help them out. And if you stumble, to be transparent about it. You see so many examples these days about companies stumbling, but when they're transparent, they get out of it. Or companies stumbling, but when they try to cover it up, it's not good. So here's the thing, though. You're also running, even when you do the right thing, there's the media headwind, which only focuses on something that's gone wrong. It only focuses on outrage. It only focuses on distrust. As I say, algorithms are designed to continue that sense of distrust so people keep searching for more. And so the headwinds are very difficult these days because the media ecosystem that we're in is built on cynicism or distrust or feeling that somebody is out to get us and so on. So one has to be always aware that the media is going to find these things out and pick on the smallest little issue. That's why the organizations or institutions that want to build trust have to be as committed as possible to doing good things, to undoing bad things, and to producing products and services that have no wrinkles and no kinks and no problems, and they have to vet them completely. And then this is why you want to be able to build diverse boards and diverse management systems. Because if you are producing something and you don't have that diversity in the boardroom or in upper level management or in product management, you may miss something that somebody else may see. Think about Pepsi and the famous Kendall Jenner video, in which it seemed like giving a Pepsi will solve the issue of the conflict between the police and the African American community. And it was so widely panned. What were they doing? They created this video. They didn't have diverse voices in there looking at it to be able to say, no, this is a problem, that's a problem. And all of a sudden, they became the butt of ridicule. Okay, so you want to make sure that you have as many diverse voices. And I'm not just thinking about ethnic diversity. I'm thinking about gender. I'm thinking about age. I'm thinking about lived experience and people of all backgrounds. And you've got to be able to figure that out. And if you want to go and try to reach new audiences, you've got to make sure that your current stakeholders are okay with that so you don't alienate and anger them, okay? Because it's good to reach new audiences, but you have to provide the care and feeding of your current audiences as well. That's why you need boards that are representative of the audiences you currently reach, the audiences you need to reach, and the audiences you want to reach. And I think that's one way to be able to build trust in what you do.
Yeah, that is so well said. I'm so appreciative of your time and your insights today. I know our listeners will take so much from this. Before we let you go, though, we like to wrap up all of our episodes with some just for fun questions here. So our first one, have you gotten to get away to anywhere fun lately?
I have a small place in New York that I go up to a lot, and that's great. And then there's a tiny little resort in Jamaica that's right off the cliffs. You're not on a beach. If you want to go in the water, you got to jump in the ocean, okay? And I mean jump. So you got to have your feet straight and go in. Otherwise, you can have a problem. But it's just amazing because you are there one with nature. You're right out there, okay? It's built on the cliff. So that's a ton of fun. But I also like to go overseas, elsewhere, and explore and experience different cultures as much as possible. So this summer, I'm heading to Edinburgh, Scotland. I'm going to check out Scotland for a bit, and then end up in Dublin when we fly home from that. But in previous years, it's been Croatia. In previous years, it's been the Italian coast. In previous years, it's been the Greek islands. In previous years, it's been the south of Spain. And up ahead will be Vietnam, and up ahead is what I really want to do is to take some boat into the Amazon River and check out what's around the bends in that river and see the cultures there. So point is, explore the world, learn about different cultures, meet different people, hear different perspectives, see how different people lead their lives on a daily basis, keep my eyes open. And I will say this, it's what I often tell my students. Don't walk in a community with your head in a phone, okay? I'm always amused when somebody is walking down the sidewalk, fixated on their phone, and they're about to walk into me. I just stop in my tracks and let them walk into me, okay? And there's a great story about this, for what it's worth, if you don't mind this little detour. Back even before you were my student, I brought in the guy who created the legendary Coca-Cola commercial, "I'd like to teach the world to sing," which was, if anyone watched the TV show Mad Men, it was the last scene of the show Mad Men. And I brought in the guy who created it, and he tells this incredible story, which I always like to tell students, which is that how did he figure out that song, "I'd like to teach the world to sing," and the idea behind what is arguably the greatest ad in all of advertising history? He was on a flight that actually stopped in Dublin on a layover. Because in those days, sometimes planes would stop in a layover and the same people would get on the same plane. And as he was sitting there in the airport, and there was a lot of young people on that plane from all over the world, and they were seated at the same tables with each other. They were all drinking Coca-Cola. And what that said to him is that Coke just wasn't a beverage, it was something that brought people together. And he had a heck of a time convincing Coca-Cola that this was what the message had to be. They eventually allowed him, and it turned into this amazing commercial. But what was the point here? He had his eyes wide open observing people. And if all we do is look into our phones and don't look at people, then we are looking into the things that some curator of content or some algorithm wants us to look at. And we're not looking at the most important thing in communication, which is other people. So when I'm walking down the street, I put my phone in my pocket and I am absorbing the entire world. And I always urge people, get out of your phones. There's a time and a place for that. Watch people, because in our business, we are not communicating with theories. We are communicating with people. And you've got to be able to see the people to be able to communicate.
Amen. Yeah, you got to live your life and be in the present. I love that. That's so good. Okay, tell me, what's the latest book you're reading?
So I'm having fun. I'm reading a book on the Beatles about John and Paul, and it's about John and Paul, the love story through songs. And it's absolutely fascinating because the book goes through every song and talks about the dynamic and the creative sort of melding and marriage and merging between these two just incredible geniuses who in so many ways transformed music, transformed our culture, were influential in arguably the most important decade in recent history in the 1960s, and whose music continues to bring us joy. We're almost 6 decades after the Beatles broke up, so 55 years after the Beatles broke up, and yet there's still movies being made about the Beatles. Jen, when I asked my students in my 60s course, why do you want to take this course in the 60s? I got to say, at least 20% of them raised their hand and said, it's because I love the Beatles, okay? And every time I give a lecture of the Beatles, which I intersperse throughout the class, it gets everyone on the edge of their seat wanting to learn more. So I'm having a great time reliving those songs. And what's so much fun is that when he talks about the song in a book, I'll hit pause in my brain and actually put the song on to be able to hear it, to see what he's talking about, how they merge the two geniuses. So that's been a lot of fun reading about the Beatles, and I hope generations from this point on will continue to enjoy that incredible music. And arguably, they were the greatest songwriting duo because they weren't just writing songs and writing lyrics, they were also performing them. And when you think about Rodgers and Hammerstein and the Gershwin brothers, they were writing songs that other people performed. The Beatles perfected their songs when they played them.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I love that. That's awesome. Okay, what's one place in the US that you've never been to but are dying to go?
So let me step back for a second and tell you a place that I did go to that was one of the more remarkable moments in my personal history. Okay. And then I can segue into what you just asked. But back in 2014, I said, let's go on a trip in the Mississippi Delta and follow the blues and civil rights history. Started in New Orleans and took Blues Highway all the way up into Mississippi. Okay. And there are no books or sites that tell you what to do. And you had to figure it out on your own. And so you had to guess where you were going and figure whether there's a juke joint there that will play some of the greatest blues music in the world. Got driving up Blues Highway, wanted to go to Greenville, Mississippi, which is a legendary place that had really great juke joints and all the rest. Went to eat dinner at a place called Doe's Eat Place, got the most amazing Delta tamales you'll ever eat, and decided to look for juke joints, but the crime was so bad that many of the juke joints and nightclubs had shut down in Greenville. So went back to the inn and just got thrilled having a conversation with one of the most interesting women I've ever met who ran this inn, sort of an 80-year-old woman who talked about what it was like living in Mississippi. And she was terrific. She helped to create the B.B. King holiday in Mississippi and told the good old boys that she was going to run for the county council. And when they disapproved of her, she as a white woman moved into a predominantly black district, and she got elected because she was able to tell the good old boys that she as a woman was going to run for this. We then drove up to a town called Clarksdale, Mississippi, which was considered the crossroads of the blues, and got to our place, and the guy appropriately named who rented our place to us was a guy named Bubba. And we said, Bubba, we want to see juke joints. Where do we go? And he said, okay, let me call up Roger, who knows everything about the blues here. He has a store called Cathead Blues in town. He calls up Roger, and Roger says, I got this couple from Washington, D.C. who want to go and see juke joints. What should I tell them? And Roger goes, oh, I know about them. It turns out that the woman from our previous inn called Roger and said, take good care of them, okay?
That's amazing.
And so we ended up hanging out night after night at this legendary juke joint in Clarksdale called Red's Lounge. Red just passed away recently, okay? We saw the greatest music ever. Kingfish, who was then a young 15-year-old guitarist, was heading off to Paris the next day because of how good he was considered the successor to B.B. King. We were literally in an old garage 10 feet away from Kingfish as this 15-year-old was performing music that we had never imagined before. Then we heard these incredible blues musicians, but it was also part of it was seeing civil rights history. So we said, where is the Emmett Till Museum? And for those people who don't know, Emmett Till was the 14-year-old boy who was lynched in August of 1955 after he went to a grocery store and there was some strange interaction with the woman there and her husband, and his half-brother went and did this horrible thing. So we drove to a little hamlet crossing the Tallahatchie River called Glendora, and there's an Emmett Till Museum. And we go into the museum, we get a tour from the mayor of Glendora. Now it's a small hamlet, so mayor is all relative. And at the end of it, he goes up to us and he goes, can I tell you something? He goes, one of those two young black teenagers who was forced by the bigots to put a cotton gin motor around Emmett Till's neck and throw him in the Tallahatchie, that was my father. You were living the history of the United States right then and there. So I can't think of a more fascinating place to visit that's enriched with history that's so central to who we are as a people, whether it's the music or the culture or our own struggle with race in this country. than that particular trip. Everyone thought I was crazy to want to go on that trip, yet I think it was one of the greatest trips I'll ever take. Okay.
It sounds.
So where else would I like to go? I've seen some amazing places like Glacier National Park, which is absolutely breathtaking and worth seeing. I've been to Seattle, been to San Francisco, been to Los Angeles. But I would like to go and see, without being a quote tourist, but somehow experience what it's like in a Native American community.
Oh, yeah.
Because once again, the people who were here before the Europeans and have had such a tragic history, I would like to know what this important part of our society and culture, how they live, what their schools are like, what their communities are like. But I don't want to be a tourist doing that. If anyone in your audience has a recommendation on how to do that, please let me know, because I think that we can visit cities. I've been to almost every major city. I've been to many national parks. I've been to many parts of the countryside. But to experience the culture of people who are here, who we often take for granted, that's what I want to do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love that. Okay, last question for you. So finish this sentence. When you see me looking at my phone, it probably means that I'm
reading a newspaper or my favorite site of all, something I occasionally write for, Political Wire, which, for those people who don't know it, aggregates the best news out there and informs us in a way that if everybody who's on it is checking it out 5 or 6 times a day. The other thing I'll do, to be honest, is I'll go to the New York Times and do their spelling bee every day. And I got to get to genius level so it becomes an obsession. But so it's either one of those things. But more often than not, it's the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or Political Wire or my obsession with the spelling bee.
Too funny. That's very fitting. Awesome. Professor Steinhorn, thank you again so much. I just so appreciate your time and for joining us on the podcast today.
Hey, it's been my pleasure. And honestly, I'm so happy for you and your trajectory and all that you've been doing over these last 20 years. But I always knew you would.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That's a wrap for today's episode. The Association Insights Podcast, previously known as the Association 100 Podcast, is a production of Outward and Upward Marketing and Communications, where our mission is to make associations and nonprofits the go-to source in their industries through earned media and thought leadership. This podcast is an extension of our newsletter, a bi-monthly collection of best practices, top trends, helpful ideas, and smart strategies delivered straight to your inbox. Have you undertaken a big change at your association? Or do you have some words and wisdom from the trenches of association life? We want to hear from you, and so do our listeners. Drop us a note at info@onwardupward.com. That's info@onwrdupwrd.com. Be sure to subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and share with your friends and colleagues. We're available anywhere podcasts are found. Come back next week for more association insights and inspiration. Thanks for tuning in.